Science is a great tool that has brought us wonderful advancements in knowledge and has helped us live better lives. But it seems to be in conflict with what we are explicitly taught about the Bible. If we accept science, do we need to abandon our Christianity? And is science really the right and maybe only tool to investigate the claims of reality? Today, I am joined by Dr. Braxton Hunter to help us answer these questions. Hello, doubters. Those raised with a Christian faith that rejected much of what mainstream science taught us maybe were a little bit taken back when you realized that people in the white coats weren't the devil. It's likely impacted your faith. If that is you, I want you to know that you are welcome here. This channel is dedicated to walking with you as you examine what you really believe and what is true. Please consider liking this video, clicking the subscribe button, and smashing that notification bell if you are deconstructing your Christian faith. On today's show, we are joined by Braxton Hunter. I want to tell you just a little bit about Braxton Hunter. Braxton is the president of Trinity College of the Bible and Theological Seminary in Evansville, Indiana. He is the former president of the Conference of the Southern Baptist Evangelists. As a professor of apologetics, Dr. Hunter is passionate about the defense of the Christian faith in a skeptical world. He has engaged in several live, moderated academic debates on theological issues and the evidence for the truth of Christianity with such notables as Matt Dillahunty of the Atheist Experience and Dan Barker, the president of the Freedom from Religion Foundation. He holds a BA in expository preaching, an MA in theology, and a PhD in Christian apologetics from Trinity College and Seminary, and an MDiv from Luther Rice Seminary in Lithuania, Georgia. You can find his channel, Trinity Radio, on YouTube. Braxton, welcome to the show.
Man, I am so excited to be here, and I've loved you for a long time. I've seen you on the 1 Minute Apologist quite a bit and other things, and this is just, I feel like I'm talking to a celebrity here.
Well, man, the feeling is absolutely mutual because I've been on your show. I've been following you and your conversations for quite a while. And that's why I'm really excited to have you on to discuss this idea of science. I mean, you're more than qualified to kind of walk us through this subject. And so I'm pumped.
Well, I appreciate that. I always say about anything that's a science heavy topic, I'm not actually qualified to talk too much about the science. I don't have any background in science. And when I defend arguments like the Kalam cosmological argument, I go with the philosophical defenses rather than the scientific ones. But what I do think I'm qualified to talk about, and I think anyone who's thought through it enough and read the relevant material should be qualified to talk about, is whether or not science is the only way to really, or the best way to know things. And so we can certainly talk about the limits of science as non-scientists.
Well, yeah, and let's kind of kick that off right there, because I think as someone that was, raised in a Christian home, that read the Bible, that was taught that the Bible is teaching very much true things, we start to kind of really doubt some of these things when we get into university, when we start to go to college, when we just, maybe get out into our own space, kind of out from underneath our parents, and start realizing that science has a lot to offer, and it seems to be demonized in lots of corners in the church. And so I think just kind of answering right off the bat, is science and its methodologies the only way to know things about reality, kind of the inverse of maybe the Bible being the only way to know things about reality? Let's kind of deal with these extremes here for a second.
Yeah. So first of all, it is really sad that church people come out thinking of the guys in the lab coats and the women in the lab coats as the enemy or something. You mentioned something like that in the buildup to this, and that certainly is a sad thing that happens. This warfare mentality that exists among some believers in science is not, I don't think that needs to be most believers. There are very specific groups that take a very particular reading of, say, Genesis 1, who find themselves in conflict with science. And of course, I'm sure that most Christians would disagree with some things, but the idea that that's the enemy, that's a problem. We don't need to have that. That doesn't need to be there. Now, there are devils in lab coats. And just as we're finding out now more and more all the time, there are devils among the police. There are devils among the academia.
Right.
It happens everywhere.
Yeah.
So there are some bad people out there who I think bad people intellectually, in the sense that they try to push science further than I think it goes. But at the same time, we shouldn't have that fear. So what are some ways that we can know things? Well, the investigations that we do in natural science, that is a way that we can gain knowledge and come to know things. That is certainly true. It is a good way. It is a great way. I'll say what many atheists have said. Every time I use my phone, I'm a beneficiary of science. Every time I take a medication, this software that we're using right now, my colleague Jonathan Pritchard would say, no, that's engineers, and engineers have much more usefulness in this. But no, I thank God for the science that stands behind all these things. But what about history? What about our personal experience of things? I mean, on a certain level, and of course, one of the fundamental problems with thinking that science is the best way to gain knowledge or the only way to gain knowledge is that your own personal experience, even your intake of the results of experiments and things like that, you're taking in through your sensory perception, and you're forming beliefs about the natural world and what you think you can claim to know on the basis of your personal experience. So even when you're doing science, it's still mediated by your personal experience. And if you think, well, yeah, but then I could get 10 scientists together and we could do a peer-reviewed journal and we could figure it all out. I think that works on my setup, but on the setup that says science is the only way to know things or the best way to get to things, it's really problematic, because your personal experience mediates your intake of that stuff. And those 10 other guys that you had looked through it, your personal experience adjudicates between their reactions too. Yeah. So you can't really get away with this. And but there is we are in a culture right now that is so heavy on science as the way. This is even taken on board as sort of a cultural affectation that people don't even realize they're taking on board. Right. You find even soft sciences, or you find things like history or psychology or other sorts of fields really trying to look as much like physics as they can, because they want to trade on that currency too, even though they may all be unbelievers in that realm. So it just speaks to the level to which our culture in the West has adapted to this idea that the lab coat priesthood, and maybe that's the kind of terminology that can make you think of them as all devils, as you put it. Think. Yeah. But the idea that they are the clergy of our day and they should be listened to on all things, and if they can't speak something from within their discipline, then we shouldn't speak about it. That's just nonsense.
Well, so you've opened up a number of great avenues that we could go there. I think one of the things that I'd like to talk about here is the dogmaticness, or at least the perceived dogmaticness of religion, of Christianity, and the kind of open hand by which science seems to hold things. And those are often put in conflict and saying, well, Christianity is going to say that they have these, hardline truths. But science is really saying, well, we're kind of investigating things. We're continuing to look at the world. And isn't that a more humble way to approach the investigation of reality? How would you respond to something like that?
Well, I would respond by saying, first of all, you have very dogmatic people in the scientific communities. That's going on both sides, that have certain pet ideologies or pet things that they're not going to bend on, no matter what. Yeah. Because, like we say, there are bad apples in every field. So you don't want to put yourself in a position where I'm defending all apologists or all pastors or you're defending all scientists. No, there's people that do that on both sides. Now, stepping back from those kind of people on both sides who do that, as a Christian, as Christians, you and I, let's say, we have heard the arguments for the resurrection, for the existence of God. We have not only done that, but we have experienced living in a community of faith in our local churches. We've seen answered prayers. We feel that we genuinely, I won't even say we feel, although feeling is a part of it. We should be afraid of that. But we think that we have had experiences personally with the one true God. Now, what that means is there are certain things that, based on just what we have experienced and what we think works in terms of the evidence and the arguments, we are in a place where it's going to be very difficult to get us to doubt certain beliefs like God's existence or like the resurrection of Jesus. Yeah. It's going to be very difficult. But the other things, like, is Calvinism true, or what's your end times understanding, or how do you interpret Genesis 1, or what about women in ministry, or what about the miraculous sign gifts? These are all things that, just like anyone in the natural sciences, we're willing to say, no, come on, we can look into this more and change our views. And that, of course, has happened directly with science, with certain people who have said, I'm hearing what science says, and I don't want to try to say science is the arbiter of what God's word has to say. But at the same time, now that I'm looking at God's word with a fresh way of seeing things, I'm seeing that maybe what I thought was there all along isn't exactly there. Maybe there's a different genre or whatever. And so we look at the book of nature and the book of scripture, and we make changes on both sides to understand exactly what's going on. We're doing the same thing as Christians that the scientist is doing. Yeah, we have certain things. You can call them dogmatic if you want. I'm okay with that. I'm very dogmatic about God's existence and the resurrection. But the other things aside from that, we can, that are not fundamentals to our faith, we can be wrong. And that's all they're doing. They have certain doctrines they're not about to change. So yeah, that's kind of how
I think that's a really great point. I do want to talk about miracles, but before we do, I just want to point out and kind of maybe put a little bow on what you were just saying there. Even scientific revolutions take a long time. Shifts in underlying philosophies of the way that reality is structured take a long time. I mean, one or even, maybe 10 or 50 or 100 experiments wouldn't necessarily overturn some of the underlying philosophies of reality. I mean, we think back to people like, Einstein, and his theories of general relativity and whatnot, those were unique in his time, and they were not adopted overnight. I mean, it's become something that we're relying on and that we're using as a framework in science today. And I say we just as humanity, but that's not something that changed overnight. Einstein didn't come up with the theory of general relativity and everyone just adopted it. There was large pushback, and you've done a lot of work on that, particularly in things like Big Bang cosmology. There were several different steady state theories, several different ways that the universe was thought to exist, particularly did it have a beginning? Was it always around? What did that look like? That didn't take on, that weren't adopted overnight, but now it's generally accepted. So
yeah. And quantum mechanics is another one. But to really catch what we're saying right here, think about this. So the criticism is, you guys are so committed to your God belief and the resurrection, let's say, that you'll never change. You're not open to being wrong. Okay, let's first of all, I'm willing to grant to a certain degree that there may be some truth in that. Not that it's impossible to get me to change my mind, but it's very unlikely. I've seen a lot of the stuff that's considered evidence. It's very unlikely at this point that you're going to change my mind. Ask yourself, what do you think the chances are that the biologists are going to change their mind about evolution?
Right.
Now, you might say, well, they changed their mind about evolution because there's different ways of viewing evolution and blah, blah, blah. Okay, fine. But the major idea of natural selection, common ancestry, abiogenesis, the whole thing from start to finish, what do you think the chances are they're going to change their mind about that? I don't think the chances are very good.
Right.
And I think it would take a heck of a lot of evidence. Can we say they're dogmatic about it? Well, they wouldn't say they're dogmatic if you're including in the definition of dogmatic that they just came up with this by faith or something. They would say, no, it's built on good evidence. But yeah, it's going to be really hard to change our mind. That's how I feel about God.
Well, I think that's a really great analogy, just because of the history that you have behind something like, let's say, the resurrection. You have a lot longer of a period of time of evidence and ways that it could be overturned and things that could push against it than you do something like Darwin's evolution. I mean, you have 150 years as Darwin was the major proponent of kind of pushing that idea forward, and you have 2,000 years, let's say, of evidences. So I think that makes sense. But that leads us to kind of this next topic of miracles, and I think there are two kind of tandem miracles that we can talk about. There's lots that we can talk about, but one of them is the resurrection of Jesus. And you have debated Matt Dillahunty. People that are probably on this journey might be familiar with some of Dillahunty's views, but even that, he's saying, look, in the realm of history, miracles can't necessarily be part of the equation. So do we have to throw the idea of miracles out as a scientist? And then what are we left with if we're coming at this, Christianity thing from a scientific worldview? What do we do with the miracles, I guess?
So there's a couple of problems here. First of all, what is natural science, which is what we're talking about here? What are they trying to accomplish? Well, they're trying to study the natural universe, right?
Yeah.
So that's going to be an important thing to keep in mind when we think about the limits of science and what it can actually speak to. So if God exists sans the physical universe, can you get access to God scientifically? Well, you might be able to get indirect sort of inferences, like this is what we do in design arguments, teleological arguments, right?
Yeah.
We look at what's the nature of our universe, what are the chances it would be life permitting, stuff like that, and then we say, okay, what are the chances this would have happened on its own or by necessity or whatever else, and then we say from that it seems like there's a mind behind this. Same with abiogenesis. We're going to go first life.
Yeah.
It's an arrangement of characters, however you want to describe these. People debate it, but in the literature, it's referred to as a code. It's referred to as an alphabet or something.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a copying and translation thing and all that. Well, I know where information comes from. I can point to something in our environment today that does that. There's only really one thing that produces complex information, and that's a mind. So I can make an inference from science, but beyond stuff like that, science can't really get at God. So what we expect, and this is more to your question, so what we expect the people doing science, even Christians doing science, is for them to go in there and do what's called methodological naturalism. Methodological naturalism doesn't mean you believe naturalism is true or that matter is all there is. It doesn't mean you're not a Christian. Doesn't mean you don't believe in God. It just means you're not asked to investigate with those utensils during your work as a scientist.
Yeah.
Especially in the natural sciences. So put that aside for a second. Now go as far with this as you can just on natural science. That's methodological naturalism.
Yeah.
And there's a reason that in the debate with Matt Dillahunty in 2017 that Mike Licona did, Mike Licona said, you guys are using methodological naturalism as a safe space to hide from the evidence for God. Yeah. Because what they're doing is offloading it onto a metaphysical naturalism. Okay. Metaphysical naturalism would be the belief. It's not just what I do for my day job. This is actually what I believe about the nature of reality. Matter is all there is. Nature, blah, blah, blah. So that's an important difference, I think, there that kind of helps get to the bottom of this.
Yeah, I was listening to a conversation that was recorded recently with Dr. Graham Oppy, who's philosopher in Australia, very highly regarded, but also an atheist, and he would put himself in the category of naturalist. And I think from the conversation that he was having, he would put himself in that metaphysical kind of naturalist position. And he was in a conversation with Dr. Tim McGrew, who's a Christian philosopher, and they were kind of discussing some of the differences where it's like, we're not debating on whether or not nature exists. We're debating on whether or not nature is the only thing that exists, and that explanatory power and the explanatory scope of nature alone to be able to answer all of these different questions. And you've already alluded to some of those. So I think that's really helpful.
But, to put it, so in the book, Philosophical Foundations for a Christian Worldview by William Lane Craig and J.P. Moreland, this is a big textbook. It's a challenging book, but it's something that I think every Christian interested in this stuff should have. And they say on page 39, our understanding of philosophy will be enhanced if we observe that philosophy often functions as a second-order discipline. For example, biology is a first-order discipline that studies living organisms, but philosophy is a second-order discipline that studies biology. In general, it is possible to have a philosophy of X, where X can be any discipline whatsoever. For example, law, mathematics, education, science, government, medicine, history, and literature. When philosophers examine other disciplines to form a philosophy of that field, they ask normative questions about that discipline. So think about these questions and think about whether or not these are biological questions or philosophical questions that are important to doing biology. So here are some of the questions. Is there an external world that is knowable? And if so, how does one know it? What is life, and how does it differ from non-life? How should someone form, test, and use scientific theories and laws? Is it morally permissible to experiment on living things? When biologists talk about information in DNA, how should we understand this talk? How does the biological notion of being a member of the kind Homo sapiens relate to the theological notion of being made in the image of God, or to the metaphysical notion of being a person with legal moral rights? See, even if you don't believe in God, being a person with legal moral rights is something secularists are concerned about.
Yeah.
These are a list of topics that are very important to understanding what we're doing in biology. In fact, when you're talking about what tests and things work, that you've got to know that to do biology.
Right.
But biology is this first order thing, and philosophy is this second order thing that hovers above it and makes sense of it. And another thing to point out about this that's very important for our whole discussion today is I think philosophy is a self-referential discipline. And what we mean by that is it will check itself. It will do its own epistemology. How do we know things? What are we doing with philosophy? Biology and other disciplines like that require philosophy to come along and speak to those things for that discipline. Within philosophy, it's taken care of by philosophy. So I think that's important.
Yeah, that's very important. And I loved those, kind of assumptions, if you will. And again, they're not that they're completely undemonstrated, but they are some things that have to be in place in order just to walk into the lab and start doing testing, in order to kind of start publishing papers and to have this idea of repeatability and to have common language between scientists. So I think that's a really important point, that, philosophy is this, as used to be said, the handmaiden of sciences, that there's a relationship there. Let's kind of end with a little bit of talking about the scriptures in this sense, where there's a friend of the channel who's talked to me before on different social media platforms that said something along the lines of, and again, I won't use his name, but said something along the lines of, when we look at science and we kind of trace back the biology of things, we're not going to get to an Adam and Eve. We're not going to get to a single pair of people. The population has never been that small. So that means that the Genesis story, by implication, probably didn't happen. That means the fall, it didn't happen. There's all of these, there's all this death, and there's this long time before the fall happened. So then that really starts to call into question Jesus's death and resurrection, at least the need for any of that thing. How, you don't have to parse out all of that, but how should we think about just that mentality of starting with the science says that Adam and Eve probably didn't exist, therefore the fall's not probable, therefore what's really the need for Jesus?
Yeah. So first of all, let me just say that anyone who says that it's impossible to get back to a literal Adam and Eve will have to deal with the work being done by Josh Swamidass at Peaceful Science, and as well as William Lane Craig. By the way, they differ on where to put the historical Adam.
Yeah.
They believe in a historical Adam and Eve, and they believe in all of the science that's accepted about this and everything. Swamidass and Craig seem to affirm some sort of evolution, some sort of what do they call it? Progressive creationism type thing.
Like a common descent model.
Yeah, so they're not denying that. And Swamidass actually, if I understand correctly, believes that you can read Genesis 1 literally and still come away with his view. The difference is, so there's no question. My understanding is it's not that difficult to actually have a genealogical Adam and Eve. The difference is, do you have a genetic Adam and Eve? And the idea there is you are connected to more people genealogically than you are genetically. Right. You have family members that are not genetically connected to you, but you're connected in some way. Yeah. And is that all that's necessary? That's a big part of this discussion. If that's all that's necessary, is that we're talking about a genealogical Adam and Eve, and I could be butchering part of this, but I don't think so. There's great discussion between Swamidass and IP, Inspiring Philosophy, on Capturing Christianity's channel from last year sometime, about a year ago, a little over a year ago. And it was fantastic for all this. I encourage you to check that out. But actually, we can get back to that, Adam. The idea is, where do you then put Adam to best get that result? Do you put it in the, let's say, 6,000 to 10,000 years ago that young earth creationists say? That's what Swamidass says. So he would have Adam and Eve there, but then he would have the creation narrative and all those kind of things. He would still believe in progressive creation, all that kind of thing, evolution, the whole deal. Craig would too, but Craig would put it further back. And there are reasons for doing that. And there's pros and cons to doing both of those things. But first of all, someone would have to deal with that. Secondly, someone would have to present and defend the notion, interestingly, the theological idea of original sin as held by Augustine. because it may be that I don't hold an Augustinian understanding of original sin. And in fact, I don't. I hold, and this could be controversial to some people. I don't know why it should be. I know tons of Southern Baptists who believe this. Pretty much everyone in the traditionalist movement of Southern Baptists affirms this. So that's pretty safe if you're wanting a good, like, safe, homegrown denominational position. But the idea is, did we inherit original guilt, and do we inherit a sinful nature and a guilt nature, or did we just inherit a sinful nature? And if so, what do we mean by that? Right. So I'm not Baptist technically anymore, I guess, because I'm not attending a Baptist church right now, but I'm still Baptist for the most part. And the Baptist Faith and Message from 2000, which is the statement of faith of Baptist, says what we inherited from Adam was a nature and environment inclined towards sin. I believe that 100%. I got a nature and environment inclined towards sin. What I don't think I inherited from Adam is a guilt nature, born automatically guilty of Adam's sin before I can even speak or think. That is a classically held position of the church because of Augustine. Yeah. But for me, my position is that we have a sin nature, but I'm guilty for my own sins. So why Jesus on the cross? Well, there's a lot we could say about that theologically, but we can't say less than he died for my sins. Not right. And everyone's going to do enough sinning on their own, right? So why did Jesus need to die? Well, because you sinned, person presenting this. Yes. So that's kind of, that would still be my answer to this question, I think.
Well, I think that's fantastic. And I think that's a great place to kind of, start wrapping this conversation up. So Braxton, thank you so much for your insight here. Thank you for bringing clarity to some of these issues and just your channel and all that you have presented over the years. And thanks for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Well, that means a lot to me. I've really enjoyed the discussion. One thing that always should be said is that you can't really talk about this without saying this. This is like the introductory apologetics thing to say about this topic. So I'm going to go ahead and say it just so we tick that box. Yep. But if you're a person out there who makes the statement that science is the only way to come to knowledge, or it's the best way to come to knowledge, you are making a statement that cannot refer to itself. In other words, the belief you hold, the knowledge claim that you are saying you have, that science is the best way to get to knowledge, or the only way to get to knowledge, cannot be supported by science. And yet you're saying science is the only way to get that kind of knowledge, but yet, or the best way, but yet science cannot support that claim itself, which goes back to the first order versus second order disciplines again. But I just wanted to point that out.
No, that's fantastic, and I appreciate that clarity there at the end, that summation. If this is something that you have struggled with, just that struggle between science and Christianity and the Bible, I hope the conversation that Braxton and I had helped give you a little bit more detail about that. He mentioned some different resources, William Lane Craig, Joshua Swamidass, and several others that I think you'd be interested in checking out if you're in this process and you're scratching your head saying, man, I'm not sure I hold to a biblical worldview because of what's going on in science. And so I challenge you to do a little bit more of the research that Braxton was talking about with some of those other scholars. I want to thank you for joining us today. If you're on this journey, I would welcome you to check out our Facebook group. The link for that is in the description. You can ask questions. It is a place where if you feel lonely on this journey, you are welcome there and you can share some of your story. And with that, I want to invite you again to doubt toward faith. We'll see you next time on Dealing with Deconstruction.